Hey, what's up guys, Merganman4 here, and today I'm back to review another episode of Doctor Who Flux. This time, Once Upon Time. So after the more traditional kind of episode last week, we've kind of gone back to the more craziness that we saw in the Halloween Apocalypse. I would say this one's even more crazy than that one. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. This episode is 100% ARC stuff, and it's making me wonder, especially because the next time for Village of the Angels next week, makes that episode out to look a lot more individual. It seems we've got a bit of a pattern, a more arc-heavy one and a more individual one, and rotating between those two. But I guess we'll have to wait and see until next week if that holds true, but that seems to kind of be the case so far. And yeah, this episode has a lot going on, a lot of different strands, and it has even less of like a singular through line than the Halloween Apocalypse had. So it's a very unconventional episode, I would say even more so than the premiere, and as a result, I think this one is probably a pretty controversial episode. From what I've seen online, there seems to be a lot of opinions on both sides, and I definitely kind of struggled to figure out exactly how I felt about this episode. I knew I liked it, but there was a lot to digest in a single sitting. So this was definitely a case where doing a rewatch really helped, and being able to sit on the episode for a couple of days after first seeing it, just allowing my thoughts to kind of settle a bit more, has made it a little bit easier to organize it. But even still, I'm not 100% confident about exactly how I feel. But with that said, why don't we get into the more specific aspects of the episode. We start off with the introduction to a new storyline following a new character called Belle, and we basically follow her in the aftermath of the Flux, which I really liked. I really liked this storyline that we had, being able to see from the perspective from just your average person rather than our main characters who are more heavily intertwined with it. So I enjoyed following Belle's journey, traveling to a bunch of different places throughout the episode, trying to get to the person who she loves, which I'll get to later. And we also see a couple cameo appearances from Daleks and Cybermen throughout the episode, which normally I'm not a huge fan of these kinds of cameos. I feel like these big bads should be saved for full-on appearances, but I actually think that their cameos worked pretty well here, because given the scale of the Flux and the damage it's done, it would have almost been weirder if we didn't see how species like the Daleks and Cybermen kind of dealt with the aftermath. So I'm glad we kind of got those cameos, because it kind of helped to sell the scale of it all a little bit more. And we're also introduced to this new thing. I don't even know if it is it a creature or just a thing. They're like these blue particle things. It's kind of a cheap looking effect, unfortunately, but I guess I assume they're going to have a bigger role in future episodes, because they kind of just crop up a couple times here and there throughout this episode, and I guess they're fallout of a sort from the Flux that kind of devour beings. They're, I guess, how does Swarm describe it? Time something or other that destroys anything they touch. But yeah, I liked Belle. I thought she was a fun character, and I liked seeing her story interspersed throughout the episode here. Although I do kind of wish her storyline had been set up in one of the earlier episodes, but I guess it's not a huge deal, and given how much is going on in this whole story, I can understand why they didn't do it earlier. But anyway, yeah, we're introduced to her thing in the pre-title sequence, and then after the titles, we get our resolution to last week's cliffhanger. We do actually get a proper resolution this time. And, well, I thought it was a little bit weird. In concept, I think it's a good resolution. The Doctor basically steps also onto one of the Maury stands and kind of takes on the burden of the time energy to kind of divert it from Yaz and Vinder. And of course, it also is the setup for the premise of this episode, which is our main characters kind of being dragged through their own time streams. But it did admittedly feel a little bit cheap to me because, of course, in the cliffhanger, as it was shown, Swarm snaps his fingers and the Doctor's standing right beside him. But then in the resolution, we see that the Doctor has already gone onto one of the Mori pedestals or whatever they're called by the time Swarm snaps his fingers. So it felt a little bit cheaty. So that was kind of underwhelming in a sense, but I did think that the actual concept of the resolution was well done. So I can't really be too annoyed at it. But yeah, like I said, it's also what sets up the events of this episode. And just in general, there's a lot of weirdness happening here. We have a lot of jumping back and forth between the different timelines, and then within timelines there's a lot of jumping around. So as I said last week, it really does feel like Chibnall has basically said there are no rules, anything can happen. And we're kind of starting to see that play out here. We're really diving into anything is possible territory. And I mean, on the one hand, I do love that because it allows the imagination to run wild. But on the other hand, it can come across as kind of overstuffed and messy, and I do feel like that is sometimes the case in this episode, where because of all the trippiness of what's happening, the pieces don't all really feel like they come together well, which is a bit of a shame. But yeah, I guess we'll see just how crazy things get in the remainder of the season. I guess it's probably something that just kind of takes a little bit of getting used to, because as I said, it's a very unconventional episode. I also really like how the Mori are portrayed in this episode as these really imposing godlike beings. It feels, I'm not sure what it is about it, but it feels very classic Who to just have them be these massive figures floating in this void, and when they talk, like their faces, their mouths don't move or anything. I guess it's more of a telepathic thing. It gives me very much classic Who vibes, which I really enjoy. But yeah, like with them and with some of the stuff we get into in the Doctor's kind of flashback sequences, it really feels like we're in for a big game changer as to what the rules of the Doctor Who universe are. And these are it's some high concept stuff going on. And it is just really crazy to me that we're getting this kind of stuff from the same writer who just 2 seasons ago gave us Series 11, which was very simple, back to basics approach, little to no continuity, and now we're just going heavy into like the building blocks of time and space. It's quite an evolution. But so since we have multiple different characters and multiple different time streams, I think it'll probably be easier to talk about each character's individual time streams rather than, jumping back and forth in the episode order. I guess first I'll talk about Dan's. His is probably the simplest that we see, and it gives us a nice little insight into his regular life, his relationship with Diane, who reappears in this episode. And we get a lovely little scene where he's talking with Diane about why he's not married, where he explains he was going to be married once, but she couldn't go through with it at the altar. And it's a nice little character touch, and I'm glad that we got to have a little bit more personal moments with Dan after we didn't really get any of that last week. But also, weirdly, Williamson pops up in Dan's time stream thingy for some reason. We're halfway through the season now, and we're still none the wiser about what the heck is going on with him. Because Dan just kind of pops up in the tunnels there, and Williamson has some sort of laser gun and he's shooting at something, which we don't learn what it is. We do see the blue flux particle thingamabobbers flying through the tunnels, but he says that they're not what he's shooting at, so I do wonder what is happening with that. I feel like every single week I'm just expressing confusion about the Williamson storyline because I have no idea what it's building towards and what it means. So yeah, that's confusion is all I have to say about Williamson. We've also got Vinder's storyline. We finally get to learn more about him as a character. We kind of learn why he was on Outpost Rose in the first place, and we're introduced to a new character called the Grand Serpent, who seems to be in charge of this empire of sorts, and he's very clearly someone not to be messed with. And as it turned out, Vinder was kind of disgraced because he was assigned to be a sort of bodyguard slash assistant or whatever to the Grand Serpent, and he couldn't go through with some of his orders because they were morally very dubious, and it kind of ended up destroying his career. But it was nice to be able to get that insight into what drives Vinder, and I'm really curious as to how the Grand Serpent might tie into future episodes, because I know he's meant to appear in at least one more episode this season. But I'm excited for that because I really liked what little we got of the Grand Serpent here. He's very properly intimidating. In particular, I love the scene where Vinder just kind of reaffirms what he's saying, and even for something positive like that, Vinder basically gets lectured for. We also get a look into Yaz's timeline. We get to see some scenes back in her regular life without the Doctor. We get to see a scene with her as a police officer, another scene with her sister Sonia, who it was nice to see again. But what's interesting about her timeline is that it seems to be being corrupted by the Weeping Angels. So we see when all these characters are entering their time streams, a Weeping Angel has kind of entered into the mix as well, and I guess for whatever reason it locked onto Yaz. So in the police car scene and in the scene with her sister, a Weeping Angel ends up appearing, and it seems to have been locked onto her now. And this also comes back later in the episode to set up the cliffhanger and the next episode as well. So I'm curious if that's something that's going to be followed up on in any way, or if it was just kind of a way to get us to Village of the Angels. I'm really hoping it's the former, because if it's the latter, it feels like a bit of a tenuous way to connect Village of the Angels to the rest of the season arc. So it would be nice if there's a specific reason why it's locked onto Yaz, and if that is played on in the next episode. I also want to mention how fun it is to have the different cast members standing in for other characters inside the time streams. It's a lot of fun to be able to see these actors take on different roles, however briefly, and it really helps to sell the weirdness of the situation and how kind of they're all getting mixed up in each other's timelines. And going into the Doctor's timeline as well, it was interesting to see them all inhabit basically a very different kind of Doctor-companion dynamic, because of course, despite not being the 13th Doctor, she was still being a Doctor, a Division Doctor to be precise. So basically this storyline is essentially where the title Once Upon Time comes from, because we're back on the planet Time in the far past, and basically the Ravagers, Swarm and Azure, have taken the Temple of Atropos, where the Division and the Time Lords have set up the Mori to harness the power of time. And basically you have the Division going in there to set things right again to how they were before the Ravagers came in. I personally found this to be by far the most interesting of the four storylines, particularly because I am very interested in the Division and the Timeless Child storyline as a whole, but also because this one, it kind of felt like a mini Doctor Who episode in its own right, whereas all the other ones were a lot more chaotic and jumping around. This one felt like we were basically getting a glimpse into what a Division Doctor episode might look like. And of course, being a Division Doctor, who else would it be but Jo Martin as the Fugitive Doctor? I did not know she was going to be in this. I had seen theories ahead of the episode that because the Doctor was wearing a darker coat, that she might be standing in for a pre-Hartnell Doctor. So that aspect of it wasn't a surprise to me, but I didn't know that we were actually going to see Jo Martin back in the role. So that made me give out a huge cheer. I was so happy to see her back again. And my only real issue with it is I just wish they would have given Jo Martin more screen time. Like, I understand the story reasons why you're having Jodie Whittaker playing the role, but especially when we get to the climax of this mini-adventure, it really should have switched over to Jo Martin entirely. or at the very least primarily with glitches of Jodie Whittaker, as opposed to being Jodie Whittaker with glitches of Joe Martin. Because by that point, you've already had the kind of surprise reveal of the Fugitive Doctor, and you've already established it's the 13th Doctor living through the Fugitive Doctor's experience. So I really think that they could have and should have done that. But it was still fun as well just to see Jodie Whittaker acting like the Fugitive Doctor and being a very different Doctor to how the 13 usually is. But yeah, it is a shame that Jo Martin herself didn't get more screen time. But I would be very surprised, now that we've actually seen her come back, if she doesn't pop up again before the end of the season. I have a very strong feeling she's going to be back in the finale. And I really hope so, in like a proper meaty role like in Fugitive of the Judoon. But yeah, I really liked the confrontation with Swarm and Azure here, and kind of learning about that the Mori were kind of the Division and the Time Lords doing to kind of try and bring about the end of the Dark Times. I also thought it was a nice touch that we saw the old Swarm here, as we saw imprisoned in the Halloween Apocalypse, rather than Sam Spruell's version. And I thought Matthew Needham did a really good job being able to properly play the character after not really having much to do while imprisoned in the previous episode. We also learn here what the Passenger actually is, and as it turns out, it's basically an being that can store other beings within it. And so Swarm and Azure have basically a bunch of hostages in a couple of different passengers, but the solution was that the Doctor and the Division brought in their own passenger with the Mori to put them back in place, which I thought was quite a clever solution to that. But it also sets up in, I guess, the present, that the current passenger with Swarm and Azure holds Diane. So we did in fact find out what happened to her in the Halloween Apocalypse, and I suppose they're just holding her as a hostage because they knew Dan was now with the Doctor. But that's my assumption. We're not really given an exact reason why they've done that precisely, or what their specific plans are with her. So I guess we'll find that out in one of the upcoming episodes, but it's nice to learn like what the passenger actually is and what actually has happened to Diane. It's a pretty freaky concept that I think was well executed. Also in the flashback sequence, we get this really interesting monologue from Swarm talking about the battle between space and time. And this is kind of like the high concept thing I was mentioning before, that I really love the idea of, that space and time aren't in tandem with each other, they're actually fighting each other, and that controlling time, like the Mori are doing, actually goes against time's nature. That time is meant to be chaotic and run wild. So I thought it was really interesting that Swarm and Azure refer to the Mori as imprisoning time, and that basically the state of time in the universe as we knew it is actually not its natural state. It's not how it's meant to be. But as this kind of flashback sequence ends, the Doctor is of course getting very desperate because she wants to learn more about what's happening in the past and try and find out the context for all of this. And this leads into what to me is the most interesting scene of the story, and what has definitely intrigued me the most of the season so far. She gets brought to this place, it's unclear what it is, with this older woman who, I think her name is Osok, but she basically explains to the Doctor, she seems to be this interdimensional, really powerful being, because she talks about how this universe is coming to an end as designed, and that time is broken again as intended, and that the flux was not a natural occurrence, it was very much intentional. And so that already piqued up my interest. But what really caught me was when she said that the Ravagers, Swarm and Azure, are useful creatures that have been reintroduced, and that they are effectively a temporal poison. There's a lot to process in that short little scene, but I don't know who Osok is, but she is clearly somebody who has a lot of knowledge and a lot of power beyond our regular, dimensional plane, and it makes it clear that, well, it seemed that Swarm was going to be the main villain up to this point, but it seems he's just a pawn in somebody else's game. And That's really interesting. I am fascinated to find out what this grand plan is, what exactly is happening. I still don't know. And I'm really interested to find out where this is all going and potentially what the long-term consequences are. I really hope there are some longer-term consequences and it's not just reset, because this is some massive scale stuff. And it's this scene that, to me, I mean, in the promotional material, we were told this is the biggest story that they've ever told. And, I mean, it was kind of unclear whether they were referring to just Chibnall's team specifically or the whole of TV Doctor Who. But this scene has definitely sold to me that this is, without doubt, the biggest scale story that the show has ever done. And I am just so fascinated to see where exactly this is heading. And it's very exciting to me. Oh, and I don't want to forget, one other thing that she said as well was that the Doctor herself is, at least in some way, responsible for the Flux. The way I interpret it, it sounds like she's not saying that the Doctor, you know, was directly responsible for it, but was at least part of the reason why somebody else did it. So, yeah, that's really interesting as well. And at the end of this episode, we see, I mean, I mentioned last week, we see the 13th Doctor, possibly the angriest she's ever been. That's been top tier because she is just going crazy at the end of this episode. Absolutely desperate. And we get a couple of great lines where, you know, she is obviously, she really wants to know, but she does not want anybody else to kind of go on this journey with her. She is being very secretive, and it's clearly something that's very personal to her. In particular, I love the line where she mentions she wants to find out what the Flux has to do with her, and Yaz responds, well, why would it have anything to do with you? And the Doctor just says, does everything have to be a discussion? Get in the TARDIS. And I don't know, I really feel like this is building up for their relationship to just completely crumble. It's just going to snap at some point. Because Yaz is going to have enough of the Doctor just not trusting her enough to deal with this. And it's crazy to see the Doctor brought to this kind of breaking point, especially when the 13th Doctor particularly has started out as such a happy-go-lucky, optimistic incarnation. It's quite a big blow. But yeah, with the main part of the story wrapped up, Vinder basically goes with the Doctor, Yaz, and Dan. I love his reaction to the TARDIS. It's my favorite bigger on the inside reaction of the era. But anyway, so he says that he's got to go find somebody, and it's basically here that we reveal that Belle's story that's been going on throughout this was actually her searching for Vinder, which came as a surprise to me because in pretty much all the trailers and stuff, we've seen her character with another played by, I think the actor's name is Blake Harrison. So I was expecting her to be talking about him. So that was a nice surprise to see that she was actually talking about Vinder. And it was good to be able to actually have that tie into the main storyline by the end of the episode as well. But yeah, and of course Vinder wants to go searching for her as well, and we visit his home planet, which has been completely wrecked by the Flux. But I mean, it was kind of weird that he decides to stay on that planet rather than continue with the Dr. Yaz and Dan. But he's in the rest of the series still, and the Doctor gives him a thing to, like, you know, that he can contact them whenever he needs. So I feel like that's kind of strange. Like, if he's just going to meet up with them again in the next episode, why bother separating him? But, I don't know, maybe he doesn't meet up with them in next week's episode. Maybe he is kind of continuing on his own storyline and then they reconnect in the finale, maybe? I don't know. I don't know how that's going to work. But yeah, I guess we'll see if Belle and Vinder meet up again in the next episode. And if they do, how they're going to tie back into the main Flux storyline. But as of now, I guess, yeah, another thing that's kind of left unclear how it's all going to tie back. But yeah, with the Doctor, Yaz, and Dan on their way, we have to get our cliffhanger somehow. So the Weeping Angel that we saw in Yaz's timeline earlier is still with her, comes out through her phone and basically hijacks the TARDIS, and that's the cliffhanger. It did feel a little bit forced to come out of nowhere like that, and that's kind of what I was saying earlier. I hope that the whole Weeping Angels locked onto Yaz thing wasn't just to be able to get us this cliffhanger, but it was a good cliffhanger. Having a Weeping Angel not only in the TARDIS, but piloting it is a very interesting idea, and I'm really fascinated to see what's done with the Weeping Angels, because I feel like there's only so much that can be done with them. So I'm interested to see how, and I guess if they do anything unique and different with them. But I've got high hopes, because as I've said many times before, Chibnall has been very good with returning villains, and also next week's episode is a co-write with Maxine Alderton, who wrote my favorite 13th Doctor episode so far. So I'm feeling pretty good about the next episode. But anyway, I digress. This is a review about Once Upon a Time, and yeah, like I said, I found it very hard to kind of come up with a solid final verdict for it, because there's so much going on, and I think I've come to the conclusion that I really like all the individual storylines, but I feel like the episode kind of struggles to piece them together, and the connective tissue is definitely by far the weakest stuff of the episode and potentially the season so far. So I'm not really a fan of how it all comes together, but I really like the individual pieces, and that's kind of why I'm feeling conflicted about it, because like I really like all the individual elements, but as a whole the episode doesn't quite feel as coherent as it should. So yeah, I guess ultimately I'm gonna go with an 8 out of 10, because it definitely would have been higher had that connective tissue been stronger, but that kind of has held it back from being any better than that. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Once Upon a Time, and I'm very interested to see what's going to come out of the stuff that's been introduced here, the concepts of time and space and battle, and that Ossock character. But yeah, we're halfway through Flux. I'm really enjoying it, and I'm really excited to see where it goes next. So please put your thoughts down in the comments below on what you thought about Once Upon a Time. And with that, Merganman 4, over and out, and I'll see you guys later.